academician. I request Dr. Siddharth Satpathy to kindly come forward and take his seat on the dais. I now invite our chairperson for the session, Dr. Paresh Joshi, to kindly come forward and take his seat on the dais to chair the session. I now request Dr. Paresh Joshi to kindly felicitate our Dr. Siddharth Satpathy. Thank you, sir. Dr. Siddharth Satpathy teaches in the Department of English, University of Hyderabad, India. He earned a joint PhD in English Language and Literature and South Asian Languages and Civilization from the University of Chicago in 2012. His research focuses on Victorian studies, post-colonial studies, Indian intellectual traditions, translation studies, and ecological studies. He recently co-authored two special issues, Vernacular Victoria, The Queen in South Asian Languages, for Victorian Literature and Culture, and Between History and Literature, Essays for Dipesh Chakrabarti for South Asian History and Culture. His monograph, Provincial Victorians, Narratives of Reform in Colonial India, is currently under review. Dr. Satpathy was a fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla from 2022 to 24. He is taught as an invited instructor for the University of Chicago's South Asian Civilization program in India from 2013 to 15. He has also served as a co-director of ICSSR's two-year Impress project on intellectual histories of Bhakti in Odisha. He is also co-PI and also as a co-PA of digitization project on a rare ODIA serials funded by the Center of Research Libraries, USA. We are truly honored to have him today with us. With that, I now hand over the session to the respected chairperson, Dr. Joshi.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is day 2, session 1. I mean, we're more familiar with the language of season. So, season 1, day 2, session 1. That's how we understand. I'm honored to have got an opportunity to chair this session. We have Dr. Satpathy with us. And without wasting time between the speaker and the audience, I welcome Dr. Satpathy and request him to take his session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. And let me begin by conveying my gratitude to Professor Dey, head of the Department of English, Veer Narmad, South Gujarat University, and to my friend Dr. Mori for inviting me here. A very useful workshop, a very useful event. I say useful because of two reasons. in general, when we talk about research in English studies in India, it means so many things to so many people, depending upon where you are located, which area you are focusing on. It means a lot of things to a lot of people. So it's very useful time and again to conduct a workshop on a theme like research methods, where people from variety of locations who are working in English studies but coming from different locations can come and talk about research methods. So that would help us to have a broad idea about the condition of English studies in India at the moment. Very recently, we organized a conference in the University of Hyderabad on the state of Victorian studies, or the state of 18th and 19th century studies, English studies in India. So we had people coming over from different parts of India, within India, and we wanted to talk about that what kind of work or research is happening in 18th and 19th century work, in 18th, 19th century fields within India. So I see this as a kind of a continuation of what we had done, or in the sense the kind of conversations that we wanted to have at University of Hyderabad this March. So my talk today would be primarily about two methods, both fairly recent. One is more recent than the other, but both of them are quite new in terms of what they want to accomplish. And both the methods have an interdisciplinary ring to them. They are located in English studies for various reasons, and I'll explain that why they are located within English literary studies and what they help English literary studies to accomplish. But having said that, both of them are interdisciplinary. And let me say from the very beginning, by the term interdisciplinary, I do not mean that you can work on any discipline from any discipline. It doesn't work like that. There are adjacent disciplines, there are neighboring disciplines. So often interdisciplinarity works better if the disciplines which are in dialogue with each other are contiguous or have some kind of a neighborly affinity or tension. So the two methods that I'm going to talk about, and when Dr. Mori alerted me about it, and he said that primarily we will talk about it to the students, to the masters and research students. So I'll try to explain myself as elaborately as I can. And if something is not clear, then please feel free to have a session to continue in the Q&A session about the things that are not clear. So the two methods that I'm going to talk about, the first one would be global intellectual history. That's pretty established. The less recent method. History of ideas, intellectual history, as such goes back several decades. Global intellectual history is something fairly comparatively new. The next one is economic humanities. Till last evening, I was pretty much convinced that I will talk about only global intellectual history, but then I realized that I'm coming to Gujarat and I'm coming to Surat. So I'm coming to Surat, economy has to be there. And if economic humanities can take off anywhere in India, Gujarat is probably the place. I'll speak more about global intellectual history, and if time permits, we'll touch upon economic humanities. So economic humanities is pretty recent. So I have in all 3 slides. So my work here would be more about trying to explain how I understand these terms, these elements, these tools. Right? I'll try to bring in different kinds of bibliographies, different kinds of works, allusions to different kinds of works, but more or less it will be about how I understand these terminologies, these tools, these areas, these methods. Global intellectual history. By the term global, it doesn't mean that we cover the whole world. The method does not aim to cover the whole world. And I'll use a quotation and come back to this slide. So global historians are not concerned with macro perspectives alone. They seek to situate concrete historical issues and phenomena within broader, potentially global contexts. So global here does not mean the first thing we need to be clear about. It doesn't mean it doesn't cover the whole world. You are not trying to speak about the whole world. It's not possible. It's not doable. And whatever you say about the whole world today might turn out to be false or can be falsified a couple of hours later. Larger patterns, larger trends, larger arguments, if they are falsifiable, that's the first step to test the strength of an argument. If they are falsifiable, it's not a strong argument. And if they are quickly falsifiable and easily so, it's not a strong argument. So global history or global intellectual history, what it does, first, it does not cover the whole world. It does not ignore the local. It focuses on the local. But it sees the local in a relational term. What do I mean by that? I mean that when we come to think about the local in a relational term, in a relational or with a relational lens, that means we are trying to see what kind of relations, be it political, be it economic, be it literary, be it sociological. So what relations or what networks of relations is the local situated in? So that means if I'm trying to analyze a piece of writing, be it in English, be it in Gujarati, be it in any other language, which is produced in Surat, and I'm approaching a global intellectual history or a global history as an approach, as a method, my first step would be to see how this work, which is produced in a very local setting, is associated with things beyond Surat. With things beyond Surat, with markets beyond Surat, with sociological trends which are transcending Surat, people who are beyond Surat, other texts which are beyond Surat. So within this setup, a whole range of possibilities open up. You have traveler studies coming in, you have translation works coming in, You have comparative analysis coming in, to name a few. You have displacement, you have migration studies coming in, you have memory studies coming in. So that's my first point. When I say, let me repeat that once again, the title of the method is Global Intellectual History, and all that we are trying to do is to understand the term global. First, global does not mean the whole world. It doesn't mean the whole world because whatever general conclusions you're going to draw about the whole world will be falsifiable very quickly and very easily. So it doesn't cover the whole world, and it's not physically possible. It's not intellectually possible to do that. So what do? You begin with the local. You do begin with something that is very much familiar to you, very much in front of you, from the local. But then the key is, the local is not an isolated phenomenon. The local doesn't exist in isolation. Even if you go to a village, you narrow down the focus to that level, still then it's possible to find how is that village connected to another village. What kind of connections do they have? So when we do global history or global intellectual history, we start with the local and we proceed beyond the local. We proceed towards questions of how the local is connected to the world that exists beyond that geographical unit that we know as the local. So these relations could be on a variety of registers. It could be economic, it could be sociological, it could be historical, so on and so forth. Sociological in the sense that if you find migratory labor in your locality, so that would be a sociological aspect. Literary aspect, if you find non-local languages having periodicals, publication centers in your locality, that becomes literary. Political, when the diaspora plays a role in the politics, either locally or back home, that becomes a political aspect to it. So that's my first point. Global begins with the local. Both global and local are to be understood in terms of the relations they have. So what we are tracing when we do global intellectual history, we trace relations. Let me give a very literary example before I proceed further. We have heard about Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the classics, right? Have you ever wondered, when was the first time that Uncle Tom's Cabin was read in Surat by anybody? When was the first time that a publisher or a bookseller bought a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, in English of course, and sold a copy in Surat? Or who was a traveler who was carrying an Uncle Tom's Cabin's copy in Surat for the first time? Interesting, right? Let me give you an example of the earliest instance of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the part of India that I am familiar with, Odisha. The first instance that I could trace of an Uncle Tom's Cabin being read, being talked about, being reviewed, quote unquote, was from the port city of Baleswar. It's a port city just like Surat. In 1871. An American woman missionary who had come from America, the Boston area, to Baleswar as a port city, She had brought a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin with her. She was reading it, and the first review that she was doing, it was not a formal review. The review came in the shape of a letter that she wrote to people back home, back in Boston. And she was saying that the local English residents are making fun of Americans as they read Uncle Tom's Cabin. Making fun? Why? They're saying how backward the Americans are because they had slavery till now, as late as the Civil Wars, the American Civil Wars. So what she said is that, look, not in so many words, but the novel she took pride in, Stowe's work, and she said that this novel, please pay attention to what she said, this is her imagery, will make its way through as a steamship does, undeterred, unbothered by any obstacle. However much you have storms, waves, thunders. So she's using the image of a voyage, right? And she's saying that, look, this novel is like a steamship that will make its way through despite all objections from the English residents of the town. Then I started wondering that why is she using steamship as a voyage, as a kind of an image? And I was utterly surprised when I found out that only hardly 5 years back, she was writing in 1871 or something, hardly 5 years back, the first 5-10 years back, around 1850s, the first steamships began to bring ice from Boston to Calcutta. Before that, it was all sail ships. So what we are doing, this story as we reconstruct, it takes me 5 minutes to tell the story. It took me 2 months to reconstruct it. To find out the details. When did the first steamship arrive? What was in its cargo? What could be a kind of a cargo that would be profitable to bring from all the way from Boston to Calcutta? Ice. Right. So it took me a couple of months to construct what I just told you in 5 minutes as an illustration of what would global history, and in a moment I'll tell intellectual, what is intellectual about it. We have not gone to that part yet of the title. So what would global history look like when you do it or when you practice it in literature studies departments? So you begin with a locality, you begin with a smallest unit. So the locality that I chose was Baleswar. The smallest unit that I chose is a novel. And I asked myself this question, and in order to ask this question, you need to do some library work, some archival work. Without that, you won't be able to arrive at the question itself. So I asked myself that when was, for the first time, this novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, began to be read in Odisha. Who read it? In what context it was read? For what purposes it was read? And what can be told or what can be reconstructed of that story? Good research. My supervisor told me, I was once very worried about it, whether I'm writing, what I'm writing is good or not. So I went over to him. And he said that, look, there is a solution to it. There's an answer to it. And I asked him, what is good research? I do not know what I'm writing is good or not. So he said that, look, are you able to tell your research to your friend in terms of a story, in terms of a 5-line, 6-line story? If you're able to do that, when you write it out, it won't be in the story form. You would write it out in terms of the academic protocols, right? There are protocols which you need to follow. You would give citations, you would give, you develop your argument, you would have to have an argumentative prose, you would have a counter, all those things are there. But when you talk about your research, one test which would help you to introspect whether whatever you're going to tell is interesting, is worth telling or not, and for which you won't need to depend upon your peer group to give you a feedback on, is whether you are able to tell that research, that piece of research that you're doing, to somebody who's not at all connected with academia, somebody who's not at all connected with your field, but you're able to tell it in terms of a 5-6 line story. And whether you are able to retain his or her interest. When you are doing it, that becomes a kind of a test to know whether whatever you are going to argue would be of some interest to people. Does it make sense? Can you relate to it? So what stories would you be able to tell about what you're working on or what you plan to work on? So my friends, global intellectual history, let me repeat, let me take a pause here and let me recapitulate whatever we have been doing till now. We began with the term global intellectual history. The first point that we made is to talk about global as a concept. It doesn't mean that it covers the whole world. What it means is to start with a very local and small unit or story, and then the ability to see that local in terms of its relations with the world that is beyond the local. Then I gave the example of how global intellectual history would look like if you practice it from within literature departments. It would look like something like this. There are other things it may look like. This is one of them. It is to ask the question how the classics of English literature or literary canons that we read, whether American or English, or Caribbean for that matter, or any non-canonical work too, how did they arrive in the Indian subcontinent? In what form, in what ways, by whom? So this is what the global part of the global intellectual history as a method look like. Now let's go back to the intellectual part. I'll come in a second. But before that, let me talk a little more about the second point that I have pointed out here, integration, capital and culture. We have always been hearing that it's a global world now. Globalization begins at least 300 years back. It's not a new phenomenon. There are differences of opinion, there are different schools, there are different varieties of thoughts about it. We understand all that. But the global phenomena, or globalization as such, has a longer history, much longer history. at least 300 to 400 years back. And when we do global history, global intellectual history, it won't be enough when you are able to describe the relations. Let me repeat that, and please do pay attention. It won't be enough to say or to describe the relations between the local and the world outside. That's the first step. It won't be enough to say that look, 1862 or 1871 is when the first Uncle Tom's Cabin came to be read in Baleswar as a port city. It won't be enough because it doesn't have a causal analysis yet. A description doesn't have a causal analysis yet. Causal analysis would mean why Uncle Tom's Cabin came to Baleswar in 1861 or 1871 when it did. So that causal analysis is what takes your research to the next level. I'm saying research is not about description only. Many of the mediocre research is about descriptions and they stop at descriptions. They would give you a thick description. Have you heard the term thick description? Okay. So it gives you a kind of a description, a dense description of a phenomena that you find interesting. But that's the first step of any method. The next method, the next stage of the method would be to offer a causal analysis. Why? By the term causal analysis, I mean three kinds of questions. Why, how, what? And of these three why questions are WH questions, why, how, what? The why question is the most interesting one and the most difficult one. And that's precisely what causal analysis would mean. So when you do global intellectual history, there are two kinds of causations which are at work. What do I mean by that? I mean that when you explain why globalization has happened, or what does it mean to have a global condition, you have to explain why this global condition happened. Why is it that the globalization took place? Why is it that it looks like what it does? The why of it. And when you look for the why of the global, why did the relations happen? Why did the migrant laborers come to Surat and not to any other part of Gujarat? So those are why questions. So capital and culture, these are two long established causations or causal narratives or causal explanations. I do not know what history of capital you are familiar with, but I assume that you would know that capital has a logic inbuilt into it, which is that it keeps expanding. These are complex terms, these are complex issues. I'm trying to tell it as clearly as I can. So the logic that is inbuilt in capital is that it would keep perpetuating itself, it would keep looking for more profit, it would keep looking for more raw materials, it would keep looking for more markets. So it keeps expanding. So when people explain globalization, the first causation that they give is they take it back to capital. Formation of capital in late 18th century, a little earlier than that, modern capital. So from that time onwards, globalization happens or takes a different kind of, or originates in its process, and it continues. So capital provides, or capital, it's the work of capital, Why you find migrant laborers in Surat, not other parts of the city, not other parts of Gujarat, or not many other parts of the country. So that's one causal explanations which people would follow. And mostly it's the Marxist school which would do that. Right? Culture is the other larger explanation for the global condition. People would say that, look, before capital arrived, before modern capital arrived, which is 18th century, 17th, 18th century, people did travel. You would find Roman coins in Tamil Nadu. You would find silks, Indian silks in Rome, right? So people did move, ideas did move, materials did move, and all this happened before the emergence of modern capital. So what do you do then? I mean, what do you do? What do you talk about that? I mean, why don't you talk about that? So culture as a component, that culture travels, that culture draws people in, that culture has an ability to connect people across different spaces. That argument also comes forward, and that argument mostly comes forward from the early post-colonials, the post-colonial thought school. So these two arguments, if you read somebody like Arif Darlik, which is a dated piece now, one of the earliest pieces to be written as a critique of post-colonial studies, not as a support of post-colonial studies, Arif Darlik. And much later, you would find when you talk about somebody like Antoinette Barton and others, more recently. So what I'm trying to tell is a very simple thing. I'm saying that whichever method of research you adopt, right, you begin with a description. You begin with a description of a research question which you find interesting and which you assume your audience would find interesting. But research remains mediocre when it doesn't move beyond that initial stage of description. And trust me, it's not always possible to do a good description either if you don't work hard. So even to do a good description, which is the first stage of any research, you would need to do hard work. Without that, it shows. Without that, people find out. It won't take reading beyond first 3 or 4 sentences of your research proposal. And I'm told that you'll be developing, some of you will be developing your research proposals and all that. If you want to work hard at the description itself, it won't take beyond 3-4 sentences to find out. Trust me. So there is no fooling there. You can't fool anybody, particularly people who continue to read. Okay. So the first stage is about a thick description. And if when you develop a research proposal, you try to act smart, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The only thing that works is hard labor. The only thing that works is hard labor. Nothing else works. So the first stage of any method that you adopt would be about a thick description. You provide a description of your research question, of an archive, of a material, what you want to work on, what are the texts you want to work on, that's it. But here is the second stage of research, which is asking a causation or a causal question. So causal question would be why, how, what. And of all these WH constructions, why, how, what, why is the most important. It's most important because that's the most difficult one. Why something happens, why this question is interesting to you. Do not assume, if you ask a question, do not assume that it is interesting to everybody. No. Simply you find it interesting and that's why everybody else would be interested in it. No. So you have to explain why you find this question interesting. So that's a two-step maneuver. First you arrive at a question. Why is the sky blue? Right? Second step is, why do you find this question interesting? So that's the causation part. Right? So to come back to global intellectual history, first you provide the local, the description, next causation. Generally, scholars provide, there are two broad schools as far as global intellectual history is concerned. They provide two broad explanations. One school relies on capital. The question there is, why is the global condition present? Why is it that the globalization has happened? Why is it that globalization proceeds apace? So to that question, and I assume you would agree that we live in a global condition, right? In many ways. So there are two responses or two causal schools which respond to it. The first one would be the capital, the Marxist school, which would try to explain that global condition happens because capital is the underlying motor, the underlying agent. And why is capital the underlying agent? The capital is the underlying agent because there is an inherent logic built into capital which makes it ever more expansive. How? It searches more markets, it searches more raw materials, it keeps expanding. Its logic is to produce more capital. Capital, not any kind of money is capital. We'll go into that a little later if necessary. Not any kind of money is capital. That kind of capital, that kind of wealth is capital which aims to reproduce itself infinitely. There is no logic beyond it. It doesn't aim anything beyond capital. Capital focuses on capital. So since this ever expanding logic is built into the history of capital, capital integrates the world. Integrates the term that I've used, I'll come to that in a moment. So capital integrates the world in the sense capital connects different parts of the world. So that's why you would find a global condition happening. That's why you would find it becomes cheaper for a multinational company which is located in US to find educated skilled labor here. That's why you would find an overcoat. My first overcoat when I was in Chicago, I bought it in Chicago. It was made in Bangladesh. So warm coat, nobody needs a warm coat in Bangladesh. I have never been there, I assume it.
I have been there, sure.
But it was made in Bangladesh and I bought it where? I bought it in a Gap store, multinational Gap store in Chicago. How? That's global condition, that's global integration. I forget there's a very beautiful account by an economic historian who wrote, can you imagine, a history of a t-shirt. She bought this t-shirt in Walgreens in Texas, somewhere in Texas. The cotton was produced, how did the history unfold? The cotton was produced in West Africa. The trading was done somewhere else. The stitching was done in China. And it was sold in Texas. Trump is mad, but with a reason. I mean, if the threading could be done, the yarn making could be done in America, it would provide jobs to Americans. But then capital is against him. If you make the yarn in America, it will be more costly. So if they start manufacturing iPhones within America, I heard, I do not know, I can't verify. If they start manufacturing iPhones in America, it will cost them $3,000 as opposed to $1,000 when it gets manufactured in China. So why would an average American buyer like to pay $2,000 more for the same product? It doesn't make sense as far as the logic of capital goes. Right. So global condition, interconnectedness, the logic, the causal connection, the causal motive is capital. Why? Because capital has an inherent logic of keeping, expanding its markets, its frontiers, so on and so forth. That's a Marxist goal. What do the post-colonials say? There's a difference between these two. They look like the same, they are not. There are differences between them. There are academic quarrels, and this is one academic quarrel. So the other school would argue, not necessarily only post-colonial studies, I'm simplifying, there are other elements as well. They would say that, look, capital is only 300 or 400 years old. Before that, there were global connections. Before that, people traveled. Before that, somebody like Marco Polo came over and cooked up fascinating stories. Cooked up. Right? Sometimes cooked up, sometimes he was more sober. So then what prompted travel then? Or what was the how do you explain the interconnectedness of the world before the arrival of modern capital? We grant that the world has become more connected with each other in the modern times. Now you can send an email, it won't take a second to reach somebody who's in Africa. Earlier people used to write letters. Before that, we do not know, or I do not know how they wrote or what they wrote. But caravans did travel. Right? And sitting in Surat has an awesome global history. All kinds of people have come here from different parts of the world. So there, the argument is culture. So the logic of culture, a culture has a way to connect people across, a culture has a way to travel beyond one particular space. It travels because it's culture. It travels. So, integration, that's what you're going to need to explain. If you adopt global intellectual history, you begin with a local, you provide a thick description, but you don't stop there. You move on to the next stage. The next stage is to explain why, and what you're explaining is integration. Why are different parts of the world connected? What drives that connection? Two answers, generally, capital and culture. Third, how would you trace connections? and this is the major punch of global history, global intellectual history. What connections or how would you trace connections? First term, networks. If you Google these terms, networks, there are entire journals devoted to it. Entire journal, I'm sorry, may not be journals, but journal special issues would be dedicated to them. So networks mean what? We obviously know what network means, but they would have an academic conversation about it. So how did networks take place, or how are networks established? If you read Sanjay Subramaniam and Muzaffar Alam, Sanjay Subramaniam has a term called connected history. Sanjay Subramaniam, I hear, he's the brother of our foreign minister. So he would have the term connected history, and he would trace how people traveled to Surat via Delhi, and from Surat towards Malabar, from Persia, from Samarkand and other parts of the Persian world 300 to 400 years back. So connections, how would you trace connections? That's the third, and let us say provisionally the final stage of the method. So what connections would you be able, or how you would trace connections? The first kind of connections would be networks. Who knows who? How? The degree of familiarity. Weak network or strong network? How much effort or energy has gone into building the network, and how regularly it is maintained? Those kinds of questions. What are strong networks and what are weak networks? What makes networks stronger and what makes them weak? Circulation. Circulation of what? Circulation of people. A network is strong if it has a regular circulatory regime. A network is weak if it has an irregular circulation. If you call up a friend every day, connections are stronger, chances are. It may not be, but if you call up once a month, twice a month, it may not. So the strength of the circulatory regime, that's what renders a network strong or weak. Circulation of what? Circulation of a variety of things. Texts, like I gave the example of the Bichestow's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, circulation of money, circulation of people, circulation of materials, so on and so forth. So one circulatory regime that I was looking at brought in English farming tools, agricultural tools, as early as 1840s. Cotton handkerchiefs manufactured in Manchester, Birmingham, I know, Manchester, was coming to Baleswar as early as 1840s. And that became a status symbol for the local who had that handkerchief. Showed it. I got a friend there, so I can have this handkerchief with me. So circulation, that's the next thing you're going to reconstruct, trace. That makes a network stronger. Circulation of people, ideas, texts, materials, so on and so forth. Entanglements. Networks are not always smooth. There will be conflicts. There will be multiple networks, at times intersecting, at times working against each other. That's entanglements, conflicts, tensions, ruptions. So what kind of networks? If something was bringing Uncle Tom's Cabin, an anti-slavery voice document to a small town in India, there would be networks which would bringing in pro-slavery arguments from America to the small town in India too. So these networks are in conflict. So you tell that story too. Flows, smooth movements. And there is another element now, it's called biographies. There is another very emerging field of research within history and literature departments, which would be concerning about reconstructing the lives of individuals who moved along these networks. So there are stories about a single woman who traveled from America to West Africa to Arab, back to America. Married, made a fortune, acquired power, so on and so forth. When? 17th century. There are stories about a unmarried woman who started her career. This one, the first one I have read about, the second one I have reconstructed. She was a factory girl in a place called Lowell. Lowell in Massachusetts is the first industrial town in America, one of the first. So she was a factory hand. Factory hand in the sense she worked to work in the factory. How and why? To make money, to provide an education to her brother. So she made money or whatever as a factory hand from Lowell and traveled all the way from Lowell to Balestra in 1860s alone. Got married in Balestra to an American, of course. And back and forth between America and Balestra at least 5 times in her life. Sometimes alone, sometimes with family, so on and so forth. So biography is the last element of tracing connections. You reconstruct lives. So when you trace how ideas travel, it becomes an intellectual history. When you focus on how ideas travel, what are the ideas that traveled from Britain to India in the 19th century, in the Victorian times? First, the idea of domesticity. What domesticity is, or the domestic woman, or the domestic ideology, those things traveled. Medical ideas traveled. Medical humanities, so medical ideas traveled. Early textbooks of medicine. So what's the earliest textbook of allopathic medicine written in Gujarati, which was in circulation in Surat? So those kinds of ideas, those would make it. So intellectual history, it means a lot of things. Here, for the moment, let me confine myself to say, when you trace how ideas move, or what ideas find traction, what ideas do not find traction when they move to a new area. So that would take you towards intellectual history. So literary texts, discursive texts that you engage with can help you to trace how ideas travel, or what ideas travel. The two domains that I gave example of, one is medicine, the other one is household. ideas connected to these two traveled most frequently in the long 19th century. So gender history, gender relations, gender theory comes in heavily. So does medical humanities. So let me conclude this method. What time do we conclude?
1 o'clock.
Okay.
No, like 15-20 minutes for interaction as well.
Okay.
So by 12:40.
Okay. So 12:30 shall end. So why was the first one of the earliest magazines or periodicals to be published in Gujarati on the modern Gujarati woman? Or what counts as, thank you. What made a woman modern in Gujarat? Strange questions. There are stranger questions, and more stranger. Where were the first Janana hospitals built in Surat? Hospitals which catered primarily to childbirth, to reduce mortality rate. Who established them? What kind of textbooks did they prescribe? What kind of pamphlets did they create, the earliest Janana establishment, to create awareness amongst Gujarati women? What kind of periodicals were in circulation in Surat? Let's forget about Gujarat, let's talk about Surat. That's how the woman in Gujarat became modern. When were the first parks established in the town? When we talk about leisure studies, one of the first modern methods of consuming leisure properly would be to go out to a park and spend an evening in the park, right? Parks as a form, as a space, as a spatial form. You're familiar with spatial studies, right? So as spatial forms, parks came up at a certain point in history, right? So mostly in India, you would find the oldest parks that you would see in any small town or any bigger town, or some of the bigger towns. You would find it's after 1860s, around 1860s onwards. And who established them? Often you have heard about the public-private partnership. It's an old thing, it's not new. So many of these parks, money would come from the local merchant classes, the local grandees. The officials, the British officials, would provide the leadership or would provide the designs and so on and so forth. But the idea of a park, that a town which respects itself, which respects its own civic sense, needs to have a modern form of leisure consumption, and park is a modern form of leisure consumption. That idea comes in 1860s and 70s onwards. What are stories set in famous parks in Surat? Are there novels set, scenes, if not novels, are there scenes which describe a character visiting a park? That becomes your smallest unit to start the analysis. When was the first time that a woman who's expecting, who went into a Janana hospital in Surat, but before going in there, she read a pamphlet about what proper medical care is, about maternity, about newborn kids. So that would be your smallest unit to start the inquiry. What were the first periodicals which were circulating about whooping cough? A common ailment which accounted for a large number of infant mortality. So, let me take a pause here and let me briefly, in 3 or 4 sentences, recapitulate what I have been trying to tell you over the past 1 hour. I am trying to introduce a method of research. This method of research is called intellectual or global intellectual history. It has 3 terms: global, intellectual, and history. What does it mean to use the term global as a concept? It doesn't mean that you cover the whole world. What it means that you have a relational awareness. A relational awareness means how a particular unit of analysis, a local unit of analysis, is connected to the world beyond it. So that relational analysis, that relational consciousness is what you trace. That relational consciousness you can trace with the help of many other disciplines beyond literary studies. You can do it with the help of sociology, you can do it with the help of economics, you can do it with the help of other things. Urbanization, medical humanities, so on and so forth. But bottom line is that what you do, you trace a relational awareness. How the local is connected to the world beyond. Next, we spoke about the most obvious thing, which any workshop on research methodology would tell you, which is that the first step of research would be to have a solid description. This solid description of what? Solid description of the question that interests you. So it could be about this question: when did the maternity become subject of discursive analysis, or became part of the Gujarati or Gujarati English public sphere in Surat? So, descriptions, you cannot do it by sitting before your laptops. It takes hard work, nothing else works. You cannot fake it. Those who are in research, and trust me, not everybody is in research. Those who are in research, those who keep studying, they will find you out. So it takes hard work to move into the first stage, and which is a thick description. But thick description is what you do not need to remain confined at. You can't remain confined at that. Then you're inviting mediocrity. You're going to take it to the next stage, which is the explanatory stage. You're going to explain why. Whatever question you find interesting, and this is at this particular stage, this why stage, that is where precisely the research questions get framed and answers are provided. And as far as the relational awareness is concerned, global intellectualist is concerned, There are two major schools which provide you with the causal explanations. One is capital, that's a Marxist school. Capital has an inbuilt logic to explain, or inbuilt logic to move, to expand. And that's why it provides connections. It connects different parts of the world together. But then there are opposing schools which would say that look what happens beyond capital, or what happens before capital arrives. And there the response would go towards, and the explanation would move towards culture. Culture also connects. Culture travels and culture connects. So then, both capital and culture, they are leading you towards something called integration. That's the relational term. That's the relational awareness. That experience of integration is what you are tracing. Third and final stage, you're going to show that integration in your research. You're not only going to explain it, you're not only going to argue about it, you're going to demonstrate it, you're going to show it. So how do you do that? You do it by tracing connections. These are commonplace terms. Networks is commonplace. Circulation may not be, entanglements and flows may not be. But trust me, there are many people who are writing about it in proper academic works. So, networks. How networks are established. Why networks are established. There must be interests. Networks must have interests. Interests to protect, interests to argue against, so on and so forth. But first, what are the networks that you're familiar with, and how would you describe them? Circulation. Circulation of what? Circulation of a variety of things. Texts, people, ideas, materials, so on and so forth. So when you trace circulation of ideas, that connects you more towards the literary studies part, that connects you more towards the cultural studies part. So you trace how ideas travel. But mind you, ideas do not travel alone. Ideas often travel with people, with material artifacts, with texts, so on and so forth. So often it's more interconnected. Entanglements. Networks in competition with each other. Networks in competition with each other, networks in conflict with each other, networks in collaboration with each other, so on and so forth. So you're going to trace the entanglements. How and where they're entangled. Often interesting stories are those stories of conflicts, where two or more networks are in conflict or tension with each other. Often they are more interesting. Flows, smooth flows. The scale of the movement, the scale of circulation, that's flows. And these I'm drawing from somebody called Sebastian Conrad. A lot of people are there. Many others. So, the final slide. So when you do global intellectual histories, you are tracing the relational awareness, you are moving back and forth across spatial units, local, regional, national, global. You move back and forth. Okay. So I think that's about it, about the global intellectual history part. I'll just take 5 minutes to wrap up with the economic humanities part. See, economic humanities, it's primarily from the 2015 onwards, it has gathered pace. it asks a very basic question, and the question is this: how are economics and literature connected with each other? What's the connection between the two? See, often I find when you go to literature departments and you see dissertations, entire dissertations on so-and-so's novel, I do not find it worth my time reading it. I do not find it worth my time reading it because I do not find it interesting at all. It has become a kind of a factory, more or less, to say that, look, so-and-so's novel, you take 2 novels, you take 3 novels, and you produce an entire dissertation. You spend 3 years or 4 years of your life working on 3 or 4 texts. It may be useful, I don't deny it. It may be useful. It may have its uses and all. But personally, I don't find it interesting. I don't find it stimulating. I do not find it stimulating because it doesn't lead me towards larger questions. So here's a larger question that I'm just trying to, I find it interesting, you may not, but I'm just trying to put it on the table. So if a larger question is, how are literature and economics connected with each other? And what can we argue about that? And what are the kinds of texts that I would work on, look at, which would help me to talk about that larger relation? That I find interesting. So if somebody writes tentatively a dissertation on the book market here in Surat, or the second-hand book market in Surat. In Delhi, there is a place called Daryaganj, which is a large second-hand books market. It sits every Sunday or Saturday, I don't know. And as students, we used to go. How does it work? Does it make profit? Does it make enough profit for people to maintain their families? So what is the book market, or how does the book market look like in Surat? Do books sell anymore? If they do not sell, how are the old established booksellers in Surat transitioning? Transitioning into other economic spaces. What kinds of books sell the most? What kinds of books sell the most? And here's an interesting example I would say. I would give, you may not have heard about him, somebody called Fakir Mohan Senapati. He wrote the first novel in Odia. It has been translated into English several times, and it's being prescribed in different parts of the university, different universities of India. He has a very interesting poem where he says that, yeah, he wrote the first novel, but the novel did not sell in the market at all. Why? So what sold? And this is late 19th century. In most of the languages that you speak at home, in most of the languages, from Malayalam to Bangla, the first novels were produced in the late 19th century. And now, as literature students, you want to go back to them, you want to translate them, you want to analyze them, so on and so forth. But here is a man who wrote the first novel, mature novel in Odia, which is a classic, which is now translated into English, not now, sometime back, by Berkeley Press, and which is read in different universities, English departments. And he's saying that, look, I wrote a novel, the first novel, and it didn't sell. it didn't sell at all. It didn't bring in profit. So what sold in the market at that point in time? Mostly you would find cheap tracts sold. So tracts would be pamphlets kind of things, not voluminous novels. Pamphlets, they sold. The content was either the devotional literature, which was produced before the advent of modernity, those sold like anything. Or it would be the lurid content. But the form remained the same. The cheap, lowly priced tracts or pamphlets. So what does that tell us about literary taste? What does that tell us about literary modernity in India? When you say that we become modern at a certain point in time, and there's a whole field of modernity studies, what does it mean to say that somebody is modern? You got to ask yourself the question that what does it mean when we say that modern Indian literature was produced during this period in time? So what makes it modern? What makes the literature that is produced in Gujarati in 20th century or late 19th century modern as opposed to what was produced in Gujarati before colonial times? These are broad questions, they're large questions, and there are many answers to it. But here is my way to connect economics with literature. So if a certain kind of literature sold on the market and other kinds of literature did not sell on the market, does it help us tell anything about the formation of modern literary tastes? Malabari went to London. Malabari, you know? Baron. What did he read? What kind of literatures did he read? It's one thing to talk about the travel account. It's one thing to talk about what he talks about the other places. But then the consciousness, the sensibility, which produces the travelogue about the other place, that gets formed by analyzing what does he read. So what does he read? Which formed his intellectual consciousness. So economics and literature or economic humanities is an emerging field, very much an emerging field. It has a long history. It begins from 1970s, 80s onwards. It has a long history, but of late, the most energetic impulse is about this economic humanities. So when financial crisis happens, what kind of literature does get produced about financial crisis? What kind of literature does get produced about people who want to invest in stock market? Is there advice literature which would help somebody initiated into stock market investing? Investing is risk taking. Is there conduct kind of literature, advice literature, which would help them to assess what would be a good risk to take and what would be a bad risk to avoid? Are there novels written about financial ruins? Are there novels written about debt? Are there novels written about how to manage household economy? Is there discursive literature produced about how to save or why saving is important? You cannot make anybody save unless you work on the mind first. So there has to be literature which would make saving attractive to people so that people can save. So in order to make an economic activity attractive to people, you would need literature. Because you're going to work on somebody's mind. How do you work on somebody's mind? Through words? Through what you write? Through an idea? So how do you make an economic idea attractive? If I say that, look, don't go to buy stuff from a mall, but rather go to a small shopkeeper in your locality to buy your stuff. Because if you buy it from a mall, chances are there will be many more middlemen who would share the cut. But if you go to a local producer or a local shopkeeper, you find a tangible person who is getting benefited by what you're buying. If I say that don't go to, in Hyderabad you have Pure Natural, a place which provides you vegetables online. You don't buy from there, you go to a local place to buy. Because you realize that you're helping actually somebody who is right in front of you and who would probably need that money more than what a multinational would, right? How do you make this idea attractive? By producing a pamphlet about it to begin with, by producing a story about it to begin with. Or if somebody says that given somebody like Trump that we are facing, it's probably better that we buy something which is produced in India. How would you make that story attractive to the people? By narrativizing it, by creating a narrative around it. And the moment you create a narrative, my friends, you are in the domain of the literary. So economic humanities is a large thing, is a new thing which is coming up. And there are many of there's a recent Cambridge Companion to economics and literature. So do look it up. And once again, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. And it was a pleasure, an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
So, I think it was a very engaging session full of new ideas, discussing how ideas travel across the spatial dimensions. So we thank Dr. Satpathy for bringing in completely fresh research ideas, and that I believe is the purpose of this particular workshop. We wanted to, what are the current contemporary areas in English studies as far as research is concerned. So I thank Dr. Satpathy for bringing in something so very new, so very fresh, global intellectual traditions. Global intellectual traditions and how humanities and economics are coexisting as spaces and how research can be done, and gave us some practical examples. Some interesting examples include the history of a t-shirt, or a story of a t-shirt, where cotton is produced somewhere and it's stitched somewhere and it is sold in some other market. Reminds me of Mera Juta Hai Japani, Sar pe Lal Topi Russi. Although all of these commodities were produced within those countries, that was a different global, not ignoring local. It was another very interesting perspective that he brings in. How many questions here? Will you mind, right? Hello. So he's teaching me how I should be holding a microphone. But it's still, I think I bypass this technology and I use my voice. So I think all of you will agree that we've had a wonderful time together. Rather than wasting time in responding to what was amazing, I think I would again hold myself and I would allow my students to ask questions so that if you have some questions, uh, uh, Dr. Satpathy would try and respond to him within a given time. So your questions, please. No question is always a big question. Then, when you're thinking of a question, I'm tempted, the second part, economics in literature, economics in humanities. I think some of you should read Ayn Rand, an American novelist. There is a dedicated university which teaches her philosophy, and majority of her literature, especially At Last Shrugged and Fountainhead, are two representative novels which are completely dedicated to capitalism. Yeah. So this can become an example. I mean, I was thinking of an example, and this is an example. If you read, this tells you how literature and commerce, literature and economy, or economic matters interact. It would be a waste if you don't have questions. Don't ask
I'll
what.
try to ask something. So many students, some of them may have already made an error of judgment by selecting those three novels for 3 or 4 years. But there are so many who are yet to come, in this process of choosing a topic. Now, when you again and again referred or brought examples or allusions from local and how even a city, there is a lot of studies taking place related to cities. So how the students of literature who are taught regular papers during their masters and courses that they pursue, when they come to PhD and it comes to the selection of topic, how can they make use of their background, the places that they come from, the languages that they belong to, and make best use of the English studies? So how to make it possible? Even if with one example, if you can.
Very true. That's actually very interesting. Uh, can you hear me? Last benches, you can hear me, huh?
If you want to use a podium.
No, I can bring that mic.
No, that's okay. I mean, we are all used to addressing audiences without bare voices. See, me, that's a very interesting question because it makes me think about the status of English studies in India. So what does it mean at all when we say that we are doing English literature here? As we know, and you're rightly pointing it out, that English doesn't exist in isolation at all. It always exists in dialogue with our vernacular languages, with the languages that we speak at home or we learn along with English, so on and so forth. One way in which, and for me, it has always been the thing that I'm drawn both towards the vernacular tongue that I speak and also towards English. So it's not an either or question for me, and I'm not saying that you're saying it's an either or. And what I find the most practical thing, a pragmatic thing to do to bring these two language traditions together, kind of in conversation with each other, is to look at translation both as a kind of a practice and as well as a kind of a larger philosophical question. So that's one way in which we can think about how to bring these different disciplines, languages into a dialogue with each other. The other thing that comes to me is to talk about comparative, a kind of a comparative awareness of, so let's say, let's take up this idea of domesticity or the household. Even in the many novels that we read, Indian writing in English, and I have all respects for doing free novels and the work on it. I have respects for it. I didn't mean to sound dismissive at all. But I'm saying, suppose we take up this question, the basic unit of a household. How a household is represented in 10 Indian novels in English. So if we start with that, and then we say that, look, an Indian household looks like this in these representational spaces. Does it have an original model elsewhere? Does the model come from Britain? Because as we know, a lot of our domestic habits, practices, were formed during the legacy of the colonial practices. So if we say that, look, we can trace what kind of ideas are coming to or from the colonial sources and helps us construct the idea of a household here in the novels. And then I go on to ask that, look, what other resources do these writers draw upon to construct that household, that idea of a household? The resources which might be more indigenous, which might be more local to the cultural traditions that I am located in, or the writer is located in. So how this idea of a household, which is an idea, which is a set of material practices, which is a set of discursive prescriptions and social consequences. So if I say the idea of household, how it gets represented in Indian writing in English, that could be one practical project to see how these ideas traveling from West and traveling from within pre-colonial traditions, kind of intersecting with each other and producing something which is more hybrid, to quote the term. And whether this idea of household keeps changing from the 1960s when Indian writing in English begins and to what it is now. Or if I ask the question that whether the household remains a subject of discussion at all in contemporary Indian writing in English. If it is, then in what form? If it is not, then why not? Because part and parcel of the novel form as such was the domestic relationship to begin with. And many of the early forms in India did have the household as a kind of a central piece. And to give another example of a similar kind would be, see how are agrarian relations articulated in Indian writing in English? To a large extent, our economy remained agrarian for a long part of time. It still remains. Industrialization picked up pace or gathered pace in early 20th century, not before that, right? Or late 19th century at max. So how are agrarian relations reflected in Indian writing in English? And if Indian novel in English doesn't have an agrarian hero or an agrarian labor as a kind of a subject, major subject to talk about, then that tells us something about the presence of English in India itself. Right? So what it presents and more crucially what it doesn't represent. and why it doesn't represent. The other thing would be to ask the influence of these global awards on literary production themselves. So if we say that, look, the global awards have a trend, a particular kind of work they prefer to give an award to, does that have an influence on the creative practices within India? So if are people writing creative practices in such a manner that their tastes are determined by something called a global standard, which doesn't necessarily get shaped here, the global standard. Okay? So these may be some of the ways in which we can respond to think about the presence of India in Indian English. Maybe.
Any other question?
No question.
Thank you.
Well, then in that case, an applaud is always welcome, so I shut up when you applaud. And a well-deserved one, I would say. It was, once again, an engaging session with fresh ideas. I think many of you should get inspired by, this two completely new methods of research. In fact, if you honestly ask me, I was there to learn a lot. I had my own notes, and I hope I'll be able to use this for my students next time they come and ask me this irritating question as to what should I do in my PhD. So I'll have at least two more directions to show it to them. Thank you very much for enlightening all of us.
I should thank you for having the patience to hear me.
I think it is now time that we're all awaiting. The sound of belly needs to be answered. We'll all have lunch and then regroup for the next session. Thank you all very much for your patient listening.